Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty important. That's how technology can sometimes actually make racial inequalities worse, even though a lot of times it's seen as like a force for progress and good. And we'll be using the introduction in the first chapter from Ruha Benjamin's book, Race After Technology, as our main guide for this deep dive.
Yeah, Benjamin really kind of pushes back against this idea that technology is automatically a good thing or a
Yeah.
neutral force. She says it often reflects, even amplifies the biases that we already see in our society.
Yeah, and it was interesting how she started the book, right, with a really personal story about, when she was choosing her son's name. And she was saying how, as a black mother, she knew that if she gave him an Arabic name, that he would most likely be flagged by airport security. It just, it made me think about all the ways that my own name has shaped the way people see me. Have you ever had an experience like that?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think her example is really powerful because it shows just how a name, something as simple as a name, can act as like a code, a
Mm.
social code that makes people think certain things about your race or your class,
I,
or even if you're potentially dangerous,
yeah,
you know.
yeah, you're right. It is a powerful example. And then she goes on to talk about how this isn't just, a feeling that people have. Like studies have actually shown that job applicants that have white-sounding names, they're more likely to even get a call back for an interview, even if their resume is exactly the same as someone with a black-sounding name.
It's wild, right?
Yeah.
That's like a in-your-face reminder of how much bias is built into our systems. And then it gets you thinking, if something like a name has that much power, what happens when you start talking about more complex technology,
Mm.
like algorithms?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's where Benjamin introduces this concept of the new Jim code.
Right.
So tell me a little bit more about what that is.
So the new Jim Code is basically this idea that new technologies, even though they're presented as this neutral or objective thing, they can still reinforce racial inequality in ways that are kind of hidden and really hard to see.
So you're saying it's not like somebody's going in and intentionally writing racist code.
Right.
It's something else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's usually more about the data that's used to train those algorithms. Because if that data reflects existing racial disparities and inequalities,
Mm.
which it often does, then the algorithm is just going to keep perpetuating those disparities.
So, for example, an algorithm that's used to, decide who gets approved for a loan
Right.
could end up discriminating against people of color.
Right.
Simply because it's based on data that shows historical patterns of discrimination.
Exactly.
Wow.
And what's even more concerning is that this is happening while everyone's talking about progress. Like we're told that these technologies are more objective,
Mm-hmm.
more efficient.
Yeah.
But sometimes that makes it even harder to see the ways that they might be hurting some communities.
Yeah. And I think those data fusion centers are a really good example of that. They're supposed to help law enforcement by making it easier for them to share information. But a lot of people say that they're being used to increase surveillance and, control, especially in communities of color.
Yeah, that's a good example. It brings up all these questions about, the balance between security and civil liberties and how technology can sometimes just reinforce the power dynamics that already exist. Have you ever felt like an algorithm was making like an unfair decision about you?
Let me think about that. It's interesting that you bring up the historical context, because Benjamin also points out that even systems that we consider to be neutral, like the Electoral College, can actually embed these discriminatory practices. So we can't just assume that a system is fair just because it's been around for a long time.
Absolutely. We need to constantly be scrutinizing these systems, especially as technology plays, a bigger and bigger role in our lives.
And that leads us to another important point that Benjamin makes about the danger of tech fixes. There's this tendency, I think, to believe that technology can solve any problem, even social problems like racism.
It is tempting to think that, right? Like some new app or algorithm can just magically erase centuries of systemic inequality.
Right.
But as Benjamin says, technology is often like this double-edged sword. It can be used for good or for bad. And the outcomes are often determined by whoever has the power to design and control those technologies.
So she uses Silicon Valley as a good example. She talks about how tech companies are essentially making public policy decisions.
Right.
Like they're shaping how we live, how we work, how we interact with each other. And yet a lot of these same companies really strongly oppose any kind of government regulation.
It's kind of contradiction, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like they say that they care about these progressive values
Yeah.
when it comes to social issues, but then they don't want to be held accountable for how their industry affects society.
Yeah, and there's this real tension between like move fast and break things mentality that's so common in the tech world and, the need to really stop and think about the potential consequences of these technologies, especially for people who are already marginalized. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a tough one. It's really complex. I think it just shows that we need to have more nuanced conversations about, the role of technology in our lives. It's not about saying no to technology completely, but it's about being more critical and more intentional about the technologies that we use and how we use them.
Benjamin also brings up a really interesting point about how targeted marketing, even though it can seem harmless on the surface, can actually make the problem worse.
Oh, yeah. She uses that example of Netflix using different movie posters that feature Black actors
Yeah.
to try to appeal to Black viewers. It creates this like illusion of diversity, but the power structures in the film industry, they pretty much stay the same.
Yeah, it reminds me of that whole thing with BIC's pens for her.
Oh,
Instead of empowering women, it just ended up reinforcing all those old stereotypes. It seems like tailoring can very easily become targeting that just exploits or reinforces existing bias.
exactly. It shows that we really need to be critical consumers of technology. We can't just passively accept whatever Silicon Valley comes up with. We have to ask those tough questions. Like, who benefits from these technologies? And who might be harmed?
So how do we even start to unpack this anti-black box, as Benjamin calls it, this system where technology keeps perpetuating anti-blackness, but it's disguised as being objective?
That's the big question, right? I think one way is to look at policies that sound race neutral but end up having a much bigger impact on Black communities. Like Benjamin uses that example of the Trump administration's work for welfare policy. On the surface, it seems fair. States can say you don't have to work if you live in an area with high unemployment, but because of residential segregation, this policy ends up mostly benefiting white people.
It's crazy how these criteria that seem neutral can be used to hide discriminatory outcomes. It's like a hidden algorithm that's working in the background to keep inequality going without ever even saying the word race. And this is where I think Benjamin's idea of race as technology is so powerful.
It is a powerful idea,
Yeah.
but it's a tough one to wrap your head around.
Yeah. Can you break that down for us a little bit?
She's basically arguing that race itself is a technology, a tool that's been used to create and maintain these hierarchies.
So it's not about our biology. It's about a system that was created
Right.
to divide and control people.
And just like any technology, it can be redesigned and used in a different way.
So instead of being defined by these categories that were forced on us, we can start to question them, challenge them, and even create new possibilities.
Exactly.
It's like hacking the system.
Yeah. And that means being critical and thoughtful about the technologies that we choose to use. We need to ask what values are built into these systems, who benefits and who's harmed, and what would it look like to design technologies that actually dismantle those hierarchies instead of making them stronger.
It's like those targeted ads we were talking about earlier. They can seem convenient, even empowering in some ways, but they can also make stereotypes worse and divide us even more. What if we could design algorithms that actually promote fairness and equity, instead of just trying to make the most money?
That's the goal, right?
Yeah.
Benjamin actually talks about this ethnicity recognition software. That claims to offer accurate demographic data to improve service quality. But then you got to ask, who gets to define those ethnic categories, and what are they using that information for? It can easily slip from targeted marketing into surveillance and control, especially when law enforcement and immigration officials start using these technologies.
It makes you wonder, just because we can develop a certain technology, does that mean that we should? We have to think about the possible consequences before we just release these powerful tools into the world.
Absolutely.
And Benjamin really advocates for what she calls race-critical code studies. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So race-critical code studies is this idea that we need to open up that black box of technology and really look at how race and racism are shaping the design and the development and how these systems are used. We need to be looking for those hidden biases, those subtle ways that inequality is being coded into our digital world.
So it's like being a detective and looking at the code for clues about how these systems might be making inequality worse.
Exactly.
And she also talks about thin description. Can you explain what that means and why it's important here?
Thin description is all about paying attention to those little details, the subtle things that can tell us a lot about the power dynamics that are going on.
So you're saying it's like reading between the lines, looking for those seemingly small details that can actually tell us a lot about how a system works and who it benefits.
Exactly. Benjamin gives this example of court decisions that seem race neutral, but then they end up having a really negative impact on Black people. It's not about overt racism. It's about those subtle biases that creep into the legal system. and they end up shaping the outcomes.
And those biases can be even harder to see when they're hidden in these complicated algorithms and all these automated decision-making systems. It's like there's this invisible hand that's shaping our lives in ways we don't even realize.
It really shows that we need more transparency and accountability in the tech industry. We need to know what data is being collected, how it's being used, and who's profiting from it. We can't just trust that these companies have our best interests at heart.
So where do we go from here? What can we do to fight back against this coded inequity? It can feel really overwhelming.
It's a huge challenge, but I think it starts with awareness. We need to understand how technology can be used to keep inequality going and even make it worse.
Yeah, education is key. We need to learn about these issues and develop the tools to critically assess the technologies that we use every day. What are some resources or strategies that have helped you in your own journey?
For me, it's been really helpful to connect with other people who are doing this work. Researchers, activists,
Yeah.
artists, technologists, people who are asking those tough questions and trying to imagine a better future. There are some amazing organizations and communities out there doing incredible work in this area.
Yeah, and we can also support policies that regulate the use of technology in ways that protect our privacy, our civil liberties, and our fundamental rights. We can push for ethical guidelines and regulations that prioritize fairness and equity and social justice.
We also need to be willing to question that dominant narrative about technological progress. We can't just assume that all technological innovation is good or that it's inevitable. We have to be more intentional about the kind of future we want to create with technology.
It's not about rejecting technology altogether. It's about being more critical and thoughtful about the technologies that we use and how we use them, and demanding more from the people and institutions that create and use these technologies.
Benjamin's book is like a wake-up call. It's an invitation to join the fight for a more just and equitable technological future.
It's a reminder that technology doesn't control our fate. We have the power to shape the future, so let's use that power wisely and intentionally, and keep pushing for a world where technology benefits all of humanity.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So what are some specific steps that we can take to create that more just and equitable future? We'll explore that more when we come back in part 2.
One thing that really stood out to me from the book was that story about Silicon Valley parents sending their kids to schools that don't use any technology. Like tech-free schools?
Yeah.
It's like they know that too much technology can be bad, but they don't want to, give up all the money they make from it. So everyone else has to deal with the downsides.
It's a pretty big disconnect. Like there's one set of rules for them and another for everyone else.
Exactly. I think it shows that we need to have these bigger conversations as a society about the role of technology in our lives. It shouldn't just be decided by Silicon Valley.
Totally agree. And that brings us back to this really important question. How do we fight back against this coded inequity? It can feel like it's just inevitable. But Benjamin says that recognizing race as technology is a key first step.
Right.
It's a pretty radical idea. Can you explain that a little bit more?
It's basically saying that we should stop thinking about race as this biological fact and start seeing it as a tool, a technology that's been used throughout history to create and maintain these hierarchies and power structures.
Yeah.
And like any technology, it can be changed and used for something different.
So instead of letting these categories that were imposed on us define us, we can start to question them and challenge them and even come up with new possibilities.
Exactly.
It's like hacking the code of race itself.
Yeah, it's about being really critical and thoughtful about the technologies that we choose to use. We need to ask ourselves who benefits from this, who might be harmed, and what would it look like to design technologies that actually break down those hierarchies instead of building them up.
It's like those targeted ads that we were talking about. They can seem convenient and even empowering sometimes, but they can also reinforce harmful stereotypes and divide us. What if we could design algorithms that actually promoted fairness and equity?
Right, instead of just trying to maximize profits.
Yeah.
And, Benjamin gives this example of ethnicity recognition software. That's supposed to provide accurate demographic data to improve services. But who gets to decide what those ethnic categories are? And what are they doing with that information? It's a slippery slope from targeted marketing to surveillance and control, especially when you think about how law enforcement and immigration officials are starting to use these technologies.
It's scary to think about. Like, just because we can develop a certain technology doesn't necessarily mean we should use it. We have to think about the potential consequences before we just release these powerful tools into the world.
Totally. And Benjamin talks about this idea of race-critical code studies,
Right.
which is basically this approach where we open up that black box of technology and really examine how race and racism are baked into how these systems are designed, developed, and used. We need to be searching for those hidden biases, the subtle ways that inequality is being coded into our digital world.
So it's like we need to become these digital detectives and carefully examine the code for clues about how these systems might be perpetuating inequality.
Exactly.
And this is where thin description comes in, right?
Yeah, you got it.
You talked about it earlier. Can you remind us what that means and how it can help us understand these really complex systems?
So thin description is all about paying close attention to those tiny details, the subtle cues that can tell you a lot about the power dynamics and the assumptions that are built into a system.
So it's like those little design choices in an app or a website that can actually have a big impact on how people experience that technology, or the subtle biases in the language that's used to describe a new product or service.
Exactly. It's about learning to read between the lines and see the bigger picture. Like Benjamin talks about these court decisions that look race neutral on the surface,
Right.
but then they end up having a really negative impact on Black people. It's not always about outright racism. It's often about those subtle biases that creep into the legal system, and then they end up shaping the outcomes.
And those biases can be even harder to spot when they're hidden in these complicated algorithms
Hmm.
and automated decision-making systems.
Yeah.
It's like this invisible hand that's shaping our lives in ways we don't even realize.
It really highlights the need for more transparency and accountability in the tech industry. We need to know what data is being collected, how it's being used, and who's profiting from it. We can't just blindly trust that these companies are doing what's best for us.
So what can we do? How do we start developing this kind of critical awareness? What are some concrete steps that we can take to resist this coded inequity?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to educate ourselves. We need to understand how technology can be used to perpetuate and even amplify existing inequalities.
So where do we even start?
There are so many great resources out there, books, articles, podcasts, documentaries, that can help us learn more about these issues.
And we can also connect with others who are already doing this work, researchers, activists, artists, technologists, people who are asking these tough questions and trying to imagine a different future.
There are some amazing organizations and communities out there that are doing such important work in this space.
And we can also support policies that regulate the use of technology to protect our privacy, our civil liberties, and our fundamental rights. We can advocate for ethical guidelines and regulations that prioritize fairness and equity and social justice.
Right. And we also need to be willing to challenge that dominant narrative about technological progress. We can't just assume that all technological innovation is inherently good, that it's inevitable. We need to be more intentional about the kind of future we want to create with technology.
It's not about rejecting technology altogether. It's about being more critical and intentional about the technologies we choose to use and how we use them. And it's about demanding more from the people and institutions that create and deploy these technologies.
Absolutely. Benjamin's book is a really powerful call to action. It's an invitation to join the fight for a more just and equitable technological future.
It's a reminder that technology doesn't control our destiny. We have the power to shape the future we want. So let's use that power wisely and intentionally, and keep pushing for a world where technology truly serves all of humanity.
I love it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this conversation has inspired you to think critically about the role of technology in your own life, and to join the fight for a more just and equitable technological future.
So one of the things that really stuck with me from reading Race After Technology is that we need to move past this idea that technology just controls everything. Like we're always hearing that technology is this unstoppable force, and it's just going to keep advancing no matter what we do.
Right. It's like we're all stuck on this train, and we have no say in where it's going.
Exactly. But Benjamin says that's not true. She thinks we have a lot more power than we realize. We can shape how technology is developed and used in ways that benefit everybody, not just a select few.
And it's interesting. She brings up the Luddite Rebellion.
Oh, yeah?
People often think of them as being anti-technology, but they were really protesting against how technology was being used to exploit workers and dehumanize them during the Industrial Revolution. They wanted a more humane and equitable approach to progress.
And it reminds us that these concerns about technology aren't new. We can learn a lot from the past as we try to figure out how to deal with the complexities of technology today.
So it's not about rejecting technology completely. It's about being thoughtful and asking those tough questions, like who benefits from this technology? Who might be harmed? What are the potential unintended consequences?
Right.
And, Benjamin talks about this idea of race critical code studies.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means?
It's this idea that we need to dig deeper into the code, like really open up that black box of technology and see how race and racism are woven into the design and the development of these systems and how they're used.
It makes me think of those algorithms that we talked about before, the ones that are supposed to be race neutral,
Sure.
but can still produce biased outcomes because of the data they're trained on.
Exactly. It's like there's this hidden layer of bias built into the code itself.
And this is where thin description comes in, right? You mentioned it earlier. Can you remind us what that means and how it can help us make sense of all of this?
Thin description is about paying really close attention to the small details, those subtle cues that can actually reveal a lot about the power dynamics and the assumptions that are hidden within a system.
So it's like those little design choices in an app or on a website that can actually have a huge impact on how people experience that technology, or like those subtle biases in the language that's used to market a new product or service.
It's about learning to read between the lines and see the bigger picture. Like Benjamin gives the example of court decisions that seem race neutral, but they end up having a really negative impact on Black people. It's not always about outright racism. It's often about those subtle biases that sneak into the legal system and shape the outcomes.
And those same biases can be even harder to spot when they're buried in these complex algorithms and automated systems.
Absolutely.
So what can we do? How do we start to develop that kind of critical awareness? What are some concrete steps that we can take to resist this coded inequity?
I think one of the most important things is to educate ourselves, to learn about how technology can be used to make inequality worse.
There's so much information out there. Where do we even begin?
There are a ton of great resources available, books, articles, podcasts, documentaries that can help us understand these issues better.
And we can also connect with others who are already doing this work, researchers, activists, artists, technologists.
There's so many incredible organizations and communities out there who are really fighting for a more just and equitable technological future.
And we can also support policies that regulate the use of technology to protect our privacy and our civil liberties and our fundamental rights. We can advocate for ethical guidelines and regulations that put fairness and equity and social justice first.
We also need to be willing to challenge those dominant narratives about technological progress. We can't just assume that all technological innovation is good or that it's inevitable. We need to be more deliberate about the kind of future we want to create with technology.
It's not about saying no to technology altogether. It's about being more critical and intentional about the technologies we choose and how we use them, and demanding more from the people and institutions that are creating and using these technologies.
I think Benjamin's book is a really powerful call to action. It's an invitation for all of us to join the fight for a more just and equitable future with technology.
It reminds us that we have the power to shape technology. It doesn't have to shape us.
We're not powerless.
So let's use that power wisely and intentionally. And let's keep working towards a world where technology benefits all of humanity.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this conversation has inspired you to think critically about the role of technology in your own life and to join the fight for a more just and equitable technological future for everyone.